I've written a new book about Marcuse. It's mostly about his philosophy, but his philosophy is closely connected with his politics. So I wanted to include something on his political ideas and experience. And I have done that in the form of a first chapter that includes reminiscences about my own experiences with Marcuse in the 1960s. I'm going to read the chapter and insert some slides on which I'll comment as I go along. I first met Marcuse in 1965, shortly after he joined the philosophy department of the new University of California, San Diego, also known as UCSD. The move to the palms and beaches of Southern California seemed to contradict the gloomy pessimism of his writings. But in person, he was not gloomy at all. I recall my own surprise at his ironic humor and rejection of the exaggerated gestures of respect that some students thought appropriate for a German professor. Marcuse was an outstanding figure at UCSD, both as a political inspiration and as a scholar. His uncompromising criticism of the war in Vietnam made him a hero for the left-wing students on campus. But his courses were rigorous. In the classroom, he was simply a dedicated teacher of the history of philosophy. My own initial encounter with Marcuse was strictly academic. Soon after arriving at UCSD, I asked him to read Heidegger's Being and Time with me. Here's where we met every week for a term, discussing and arguing over the meaning of this famous and very obscure text. Despite his scholarly commitment, Marcuse became a target of criticism, of conservative criticism, and was eventually expelled from the university in a complicated maneuver designed to placate Governor Ronald Reagan while preserving the appearance of academic freedom. Marcuse viewed Hegel, Husserl, and with serious reservations Heidegger as great idealist philosophers with whom he was still engaged in debate. From Hegel, he took the idea that each stage in history lives in the shadow of a better future, the realization of which it obstructs. We who studied with Marcuse found in his Hegelian vision a validation of our own dissent. Our protests were not merely personal, but belonged to history with a capital H. Marcuse believed, perhaps incorrectly, that he took very little from his teacher, Martin Heidegger. Here's an image of Husserl, who was Heidegger's teacher, and Heidegger, who was Marcuse's teacher. Marcuse's disappointment over Heidegger's Nazism was never assuaged. He acknowledged the importance of Heidegger's false path as an advance to the outer limits of bourgeois philosophy. What did he mean by this backhanded tribute? Marcuse criticized Heidegger's early phenomenological approach for abandoning the concrete ground of history. But there was something right about a philosophy that could resist the hegemony of the facts, the uncritical scientific naturalism then predominant in American philosophy. And Marcuse's own most radical speculations on what he called the new sensibility of the new left implied a phenomenological concept of lived experience, an aesthetic life world. Some of us were immunized against positivism with a therapeutic dose of phenomenology we learned from him, despite his own skepticism. Even before he became famous, Marcuse was the star of the UCSD philosophy department. His erudition and charm gained him the respect of many scientists in this science-dominated university. His speeches at the rallies against the war in Vietnam were attended by hundreds and eventually thousands of students on our rapidly growing campus. We knew how fortunate we were to have a teacher like him, and I think he was truly dedicated to us, despite our clumsiness and naivete. He took his intellectual mission seriously, but he also demonstrated with us for our causes, which were his as well. So here he is at one of our demonstrations, You can see in the foreground the policeman who's busy keeping order. When his student, Angela Davis, was accused of murder and placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, he defended her publicly, attracting undesirable attention on the right. Here's Marcuse with Angela, and here's an example of the undesirable attention. That's Marcuse hung in effigy in front of the San Diego City Hall. And here are the American Legionnaires bringing down their effigy of the Marxist Marcuse. When Marcuse's life was threatened, his students showed up to patrol his house. When he was fired from the university, we wanted to protest, but he discouraged us. He had worked out a deal allowing him to finish his work with his last graduate students. I benefited from this deal. His priorities were clear. Marcuse is remembered today primarily for his remarkable prominence during the 1960s and 70s. Few philosophers have achieved such fame. He was not simply a public intellectual, he was a media celebrity, precisely the sort of thing he criticized in his writings. I was present when he first discovered his paradoxical status. He was already well known on the left and in the academy in the United States and Germany, but he was not yet famous in the world at large. He arrived in Paris for a UNESCO conference on Marx in early May of 1968, just as the largest protest movement of the 1960s broke out a few blocks from his hotel. Here's the UNESCO building where he was supposed to speak, and here's what was going on outside. On entering the main conference hall, Marcuse was swarmed by journalists with cameras and notebooks. Unbeknownst to him, he had been the object of a press campaign in the preceding week, which painted him as the idol of the student revolt. This is the Nouvel Observateur, with Marcuse on the cover and the headline, L'idole des étudiants rebelles. A few weeks later, the newspapers published articles refuting their own inflated estimate of his role. Observing Marcuse's discomfort at this unexpected attention at the UNESCO conference, a young reporter whispered in my ear that he would be happy to help the professeur escape. When he promised to ask no questions, I agreed to relay his message. We soon found ourselves in a small car fleeing the scene, to Marcuse's great relief. The reporter offered to take us anywhere in Paris we wanted to go. Marcuse asked to meet the North Vietnamese delegation to the Paris peace talks, which had just begun. At the desk of the Lutetia Hotel, we requested an audience with the Vietnamese delegation. They sent us the delegate responsible for public relations. He was a small, extremely thin, poorly dressed fellow who could not have looked less like a diplomat. Here are some members of the delegation, with Le Duan, the head of the Vietnamese Communist Party, in Hanoi before taking the plane for Paris. The Vietnamese delegate opened the conversation by complimenting Marcuse on his great age. Marcuse was taken aback. He did not think of himself as the Ancient of Days. On the contrary, after a further exchange of compliments, the conversation took a political turn. Marcuse warned the Vietnamese not to count on the American working class to end the war. No doubt the Vietnamese had reached the same conclusion long before. On the walk to his hotel afterwards, Marcuse was recognized by the students who had just seized the École des Beaux-Arts. Here's the entrance to the École des Beaux-Arts where the students accosted Marcuse. And here's what they were doing inside. They were making posters like this one that they spread all over the city. This one says, "The police posts at the Beaux-Arts, the Beaux-Arts posts in the street." The students invited him to address their General Assembly. He greeted them in the name of the American student movement and praised them for rejecting consumer society. This puzzled the Maoists in the audience, who were seeking a Chinese-style worker-peasant alliance against French capitalism. Marcuse presented a rather different notion in his UNESCO talk, entitled Re-examination of the Concept of Revolution. He argued that the revolution was no longer just a matter of replacing one ruling class with another, but also concerned the technological underpinnings of modern societies. What he called the continuity of domination could be broken only by transforming the repressive technological apparatus. This talk at UNESCO first got me seriously interested in technology, and I have pursued the subject ever since. Here's the cover of my latest book. Marcuse's Marxism was very different from the orthodoxy that prevailed in most of the French left at that time. Like his Frankfurt School colleagues, Horkheimer and Adorno, he had lost hope in proletarian revolution for the foreseeable future. Here are the members of the Frankfurt School. Advanced capitalism had integrated the working class. Consumer society offered benefits, to be sure, but it blocked radical change, the move beyond capitalism to a democratic form of socialism made possible by the very same technological advance that delivered the goods. The new contradiction of the society, succeeding the now muted conflict between capital and labor, consisted in the contrast between its immense wealth, sufficient under socialism to provide everyone with security and leisure, and the unending competitive scramble for an ever-increasing supply of private commodities. To the extent that this contradiction becomes conscious and provokes resistance, the society is threatened. Marcuse soon identified this threat with the French May events of 1968. This was the last major outburst of opposition to advanced capitalism. Its famous slogan, "All power to the imagination," corresponded exactly with Marcuse's transformative vision. The events, like the New Left, prefigured the generalization of the consciousness of freedom. 1968 was what Walter Benjamin called the messianic moment, if on a small scale that only prefigured the future. It laid down the horizon of progressive possibility for our time. Marcuse paid tribute to the activists who animated the movement in the preface to his most optimistic book, An Essay on Liberation. He recognized himself in the students rebelling around the world, who in turn recognized themselves in this figure from a heroic past. Young people rejecting consumer society and the capitalist rat race found in him a confirmation of their own political commitment. His confidence in the validity of ethical and social ideals and his call to defend them challenged the prevailing cynicism. What was it about Marcuse that made him the symbol of this moment? He was not flamboyant and did not seek publicity. His writings were widely considered obscure, and although his books sold widely, it is hard to believe they were widely read. Two things made him such an attractive symbol. Certain of his ideas converged with the sensibility of the movement, and he emanated a peculiar kind of personal authority. He was not only old, he was a German philosopher who had lived through many of the most important events of the 20th century and survived to tell the tale. It is easy to dismiss the enthusiasm of youth, but not so easy to ignore the fidelity of age to the dreams of youth. This is where Marcuse, like his friend Lucien Goldmann, differed from many of those who attended the UNESCO conference. In the middle of one tedious panel discussion, Goldmann expressed outrage that we were merely discussing revolution when the real thing unfolded outside the conference hall in the streets. But not all the participants took the movement seriously. After Marcuse left Paris, I met a well-known Italian Marxist in the courtyard of the Sorbonne, which we students had just liberated a few days before. I was full of enthusiasm, but he complained that we had created a carnival, not a revolution. So that's me in front of the Sorbonne in those days, and this is what we were doing inside. Adorno's notion that the movement was a form of pseudo-activity had a certain currency among older left-wing intellectuals who failed to recognize themselves in its slogans, demands, and crucially, its style. Marcuse did not share our confidence that revolution was around the corner, but he appreciated our spirit and found traces in it of the negativity advocated by the Frankfurt School. Certainly, Marcuse understood the extent of the crisis better than those who dismissed it. Soon after the conference, I participated in a march from the Sorbonne to the famous Renault factory in Boulogne-Billancourt, occupied by its striking workers, along with hundreds of other factories. So here's an image of that demonstration. You can see the students below and the workers on the roof of the factory. We sang the International, and you can see me actually in the background reading I must be reading a leaflet. For more information on the May events, see my book, When Poetry Ruled the Streets. As Marcuse later explained, it was merely a coincidence that his ideas linked him to a movement he no more than others had foreseen. But what a coincidence! Marcuse called for a less repressive society that valued peace and pleasure over war and sacrifice. He argued for eliminating the competitive pressures and acquisitiveness of rich societies in which poverty could finally be eliminated and work transformed into a creative activity. He protested inequality and media manipulation and analyzed their causes in the structure of the system. These ideas were all themes of the movement. Indeed, they quickly became cliches. They were developed with philosophical rigor in his books and speeches. Much has been made of Marcuse's ideas on sexuality. They were explained in this famous book. He is remembered mistakenly as an advocate of the sort of orgiastic excess associated in the public mind with the movement, if not actually enjoyed by many of the participants. In fact, he anticipated some of Foucault's most counterintuitive conclusions about the politics of sexuality. He introduced the concept of repressive desublimation to explain the instrumentalization of sex by the capitalist system. He argued that the intense focus on sexual attractiveness and sexual activity was not liberating, but was part of the larger process of containing libidinal energy within the confines of the existing society. Of course, Marcuse opposed the sexual puritanism that still held sway in America, but he also sounded the alarm over exaggerated expectations of sexual liberation. A shared dystopian vision of American society constituted the most interesting of the coincidental convergences between Marcuse and the movement. Here's the book in which he explained his vision, his dystopian vision of America. The New Left experienced America as a closed system capable of repelling or absorbing opposition. Marcuse's thought belonged to a tradition of dystopian critique which had long expressed such notions. Like Huxley, he saw a threat to individuality in the rise of modern technological society. Cultural pessimism of this sort was rare on the left, where most Marxists still celebrated technical progress while anxiously awaiting the proletarian revolution. By contrast, Marcuse emphasized the role of science and technology in the organization of a repressive system. These themes appealed to a generation of young people who grew up in the America of the 1950s, when the ideology of progress was at its height. We were masters of the atom and had put a man on the moon. No less significant was the integration of the labor unions into consumer society, which demonstrated the obsolescence of socialism. These achievements announced the end of history, the triumph of the existing society over its own utopian potential. To many in the New Left and the counterculture, radical change seemed both necessary and impossible. But paradoxically, by the end of the 1960s, the dystopian vision of isolated social critics like Marcuse was echoed by a mass movement. For, for that movement, the struggle against the war in Vietnam became a surrogate for the struggle against the imperium of technology at home. Beyond these convergences of ideas, there was a peculiar charisma about Marcuse's person, evident to those present at the many protest meetings at which he spoke. He did not indulge in the emotional gestures and rhetorical flourishes of a political orator, but addressed his audience soberly as someone authorized by historical experience and philosophical reflection. This stance made a shocking contrast to the content of his discourse. Here was an old and presumably wise professor calmly advocating revolution in complacent and self-satisfied America. But perhaps something more profound was at work in Marcuse's astonishing presence. He had participated as a young conscript in the Berlin Soldiers' Council in the German Revolution that followed World War I. Here's some of the soldiers in the Soldiers' Council. They seem to be at a meeting addressing a crowd. Marcuse had fled the Nazis and worked for their defeat during the Second World War and for the denazification of German society afterwards. He had criticized both post-war American society and Soviet communism as failed realizations of emancipatory ideals. Few of those present at his speeches were aware of the details, but these accumulated experiences seemed somehow expressed in his person, in the deep and strongly accented voice that spoke with authority of the European disaster and foresaw a similar fate for American imperial ambitions. Marcuse's presence evoked a kind of mentorship. He taught by example the value of a life of political engagement. These impressions of his impact can be explained in terms of the theory of experience he shared with his Frankfurt School colleagues. They worried that modern life had damaged the capacity for experience. Presumably, in earlier times, a richer and more complex relation to reality was available. Walter Benjamin was the source of this critical notion of experience. Here's the experience. Imagine having this. You see the soldier leading the march with a red flag. Imagine having this in your background from when you were 20 years old. And here's Walter Benjamin with his favorite painting by Paul Klee, which shows the angel of history. And Benjamin explained that the angel was being driven backward by the wind of history, a terrible storm of history moving him forward while piling up ruins as it passes. Marcuse followed Benjamin in distinguishing between Erfahrung, experience shaped by a deep relation to reality, and Erlebnis, experience as a momentary response to passing sensation. Erfahrung registers the real at a subconscious level and changes the person who undergoes it, while Erlebnis is a defensive response to the speed and shock of daily life in modern society. Erlebnis has no resonance and quickly slips out of consciousness as new experiences challenge the subject. These characteristic modern experiences leave few traces in contrast to Erfahrung, which has existential depth. Marcuse represented the possibility and the result of a rich and deeply reflected political Erfahrung, something not available to his young audience. Marcuse's long political history and deep knowledge of Marxism made for occasional disagreements with the young revolutionaries who received him with so much enthusiasm. He constantly exhorted them to attend to theory and work on organization. Anti-intellectualism and ritual anti-authoritarianism are false paths, he said. Spontaneity is good, but organized spontaneity is better. No, rock concerts do not prefigure socialist community. It is foolish to fetishize violence. It has a place in defense of the right to protest, but terrorism under democratic conditions is not a legitimate political weapon. I could continue, but these proved to be minor disagreements. Despite them, Marcuse remained in solidarity with the movement, at which he called the true historical heirs of the great socialist tradition. As such, the New Left had something to teach Marcuse. His historical experience was not yet over. His involvement in the New Left represented a final chapter in which his own ideas underwent a further transformation. What did he draw from the movement? Here we have his own testimony and many articles and books written from the late 60s until his death in 1979. These texts testify to a revision of his earlier dystopianism. The one-dimensional society was challenged at the level of culture, if not effectively at the political level. This is a graffiti from the French May events of '68. It says, "Plutôt la vie," rather life. Cultural revolution here means politics in the depth dimension of the psyche, at the level of needs and identities. Marcuse had argued earlier that advanced capitalism reached down into the very instincts with its promised paradise of consumption. The manipulation of consciousness by the system leads to the internalization of social control. Now, he claimed, this overwhelming force of social integration was answered by a new form of resistance. This was not simply a matter of political opinions or intellectual critique, but more profoundly, an existential revulsion at the destructiveness of the system. The New Left mobilized new tactics against the new psychic oppression. Instead of a unified socialist party based in the labor movement, it put forward demands emanating from various marginalized sectors of social life, such as minority communities, youth, students. Their actions were more or less spontaneous and so difficult to prevent. They innovated new ways of attracting attention in the absence of access to the mass media, such as dramatic, even clownish demonstrations of dissent. Here's one demonstration, Ring Around the Rosie. And here's a famous incident in which the Yippie Party nominated a pig named Pegasus to be president of the United States, but the pig was quickly arrested by the forces of order, as you can see from this slide. New forms of sociability flowered, such as collective living spaces known as communes. New media appeared, the so-called underground press, that carried the message outside the regular channels of information. Here's a magazine that we created in 1965 with Marcuse's encouragement. It was primarily a magazine about the war in Vietnam, but we also had some philosophical articles, including one by Marcuse. And here are the editors and contributors having a friendly dinner with Marcuse. And here is a underground newspaper that was started by Marcuse's students in San Diego in 1970. It ran for some years and had quite an impact. Of course, Marcuse never imagined that students could overthrow the system. He always insisted that revolution, were it possible at all, could only be the work of the mass of the population. Rather, what the New Left and the counterculture revealed was the new sensibility that, if generalized, would destabilize the society and expose it to revolutionary transformation. This theory, explained in an essay on liberation, was an implicit response to the pessimistic vision of the decline of experience. The new sensibility, rather than the old idea of class consciousness, constituted the threat to capitalism. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that Marcuse reinterpreted the notion of consciousness in this richer form, revealed by the contemporary movements for radical change. Marcuse made his earliest contribution to Marxist theory while studying with Heidegger. This was a new theory of the revolutionary disposition, which challenged the traditional notion of class consciousness. Under the influence of Lukács, Heideggerian concepts were given a Marxist interpretation. Inauthenticity was understood as reification, overcome by the transforming or radical act. This was Marcuse's appropriation of the Heideggerian notion of authenticity, which he interpreted as a fundamentally critical stance toward the existing world. What excited him about the New Left was the return of an existential politics, a politics of global refusal of the existing society and the identities it supported. The individual's very being rebelled at the conformist pressures of the post-World War II world. Their resistance was expressed not simply in discourse or strategic calculations, but in emotion and action, and had to be so expressed. The simple fact of negativity was not significant in itself. But what lent it significance was the rejection of war and racism, the demand for a just society that privileged solidarity over competition, and the hope for a pacified relation to nature based on a less destructive technological dispensation. Marcuse conceived this as the determinate negation of the existing society, the potentialities blocked by the system. Interpreted in terms of the moral and aesthetic tradition, the new sensibility of the New Left represented a new form of individuality and a new mode of experience that it challenged capitalist reification and its consequences in the pursuit of a more humane society. The new sensibility was informed by the aesthetic imagination, which opened up the aura of possibility surrounding the facts of life established by capitalism and the technological system that supported it. Why aesthetics? Here's a phrase Marcuse wrote: art cannot change the world, but it can contribute to changing the consciousness and drives of the men and women who could change the world. One commentator on Marcuse's work writes, quote, "The construction of a free existence is an aesthetic undertaking in that it is guided by criteria which traditionally have characterized works of art." Unquote. Perception was no longer confined to the given, but had become critical in terms of those criteria: beauty, harmony, focus on the essential. Alternatives to the oppressive structures of the society appeared thinkable once again. The individuals regained the mental independence required to break with the rituals of conformity that bound them to the system. The personal had become political, as participants in the movement liked to say. The New Left thus renewed the power of the negative, the driving force behind history. But for Marcuse, it was not enough for the personal to become political. It was also necessary for the political to become technological. Here his thought joined that of the most radical participants in the movement. After 1968, he amplified his earlier rather abstract remarks on technology. At a time when many Marxists were skeptical of environmentalism, seen as a diversion from the class struggle, he argued that the technological domination of both human beings and nature traces back to the same source: the indifference of capitalism to the essential potentialities of life. But Marcuse was no technophobe. He did not propose a return to pre-modern conditions. Rather, he argued that the imagination could inform technological design and realize the values of the movement in the very structures of the machines. A technology respectful of human beings and nature could replace a system adapted to competition and war. This would be a technology of liberation, capable of supporting a modern society without reproducing the domination inherited from the past. These speculations on technology turned out to be prescient. There is a new spirit of concern for nature, and whether it is compatible with capitalism as we know it is very much in question. Today we are in the midst of a vast movement to transform technology in response to climate change, although it is not clear that this will have the radical consequences Marcuse foresaw. Perhaps technology is another scene on which the dystopian logic of advanced capitalism has the power to absorb all opposition. Perhaps not. What are we to make of these late developments in Marcuse's thought? His ideas seem remote after the last 40 years of increasingly reactionary political and economic developments. Yet the horizon of radical politics has not shifted much since his day. Marcuse argued that despite its collapse in the mid-1970s, the New Left would leave its mark on the future of radical politics. He wrote that the New Left differed from earlier socialist movements in, quote, its insistence on the subversion of experience and individual consciousness, on a radical revolution of the system of needs and gratifications. In short, the persistent demand for a new subjectivity, end quote. The New Left, he said, called for rebellion and change in human existence, and it redefined the concept of revolution, end quote. These consequences of the break with the old left persist. For the most part, left political activity no longer takes the form of party militancy, but consists in the sort of punctual protests against the dominant way of life that characterized the New Left. We still hope for many of the changes it struggled to achieve. Feminism, racial equality, environmentalism, various democratic alternatives to capitalism all survive as ideals, despite what Marcuse called the preventive counter-revolution that responded politically to the rise of the new forms of radicalism. Marcuse's contribution to the early Frankfurt School is now overshadowed by Benjamin and Adorno. Their ideas influenced him, but his political thought goes far beyond theirs. Benjamin's politics are revolutionary, but only sketched in brilliant aphorisms. Adorno's polemic against identity embraced not merely the repressive capitalist version of social unity, but any harmony not confined to the sphere of art. As a result, it is difficult to relate his thought to politics. Marcuse retained and transformed the classical philosophical project of reconciliation of individual with society, human beings with nature, and subject with object. His fidelity to that project explains why he is the only member of the Frankfurt School to have elaborated a revolutionary political theory. The eclipse of Marcuse's thought represents a startling reversal of fortune. Hundreds of thousands of copies of his books were sold, and he was, for a time, the public face of the Frankfurt School all over the world. Here's the Taiwanese edition of One Dimensional Man. These books were not mere popularizations, but difficult and innovative philosophical works. Yet with the passing of the historical moment in which the Frankfurt School reached a wide public through his work, he is too often dismissed. An academic culture that values difficulty and dismisses utopian thinking finds him hard to appreciate for lack of these dubious qualities. And as the left declined, the academy became the main audience for radical philosophy. Was Marcuse the naive romantic he is often taken for today? A romantic, yes, but not naive. He was well aware of the danger of underestimating the obstacles to a radical transformation of the human condition. Bruegel's famous painting of the fall of Icarus hung on the wall of his dining room. It shows the barely visible legs of the fallen hero as he plunges into the ocean, a punishment for flying too close to the sun with his artificial wings. And you can see the legs in the lower right-hand corner, barely visible. Perhaps the painting reminded Marcuse of the warning implied in Auden's poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts. Here's a few lines from the poem. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster, end quote. The message? Idealists beware. There is serious irony here, the irony of someone who has suffered terrible disappointment but not given up hope. Why not, after all the tragic catastrophes of the 20th century? There are two motives that stand out. A belief that life and nature itself contain active forces working towards survival and fulfillment, and a belief that these forces are echoed by universal reason. To give up would be an unjustifiable betrayal paid for in intellectual complacency and abject conformism. Marcuse wrote, "Reason contradicts the established order of men and things on behalf of existing societal forces that reveal the irrational character of this order. For rational is a mode of thought and action which is geared to reduce ignorance, destruction, brutality, and oppression." Marcuse also wrote, "Critical theory preserves obstinacy as a genuine quality of philosophical thought." End quote. The obstinate refusal of intellectual compromise characterized his whole life and work, despite the many unfavorable circumstances. Samuel Beckett detected this essential aspect of Marcuse's existential stance and commemorated it in a poem. I'll just read the English translation. "Step by step, nowhere, not a single one knows how. Tiny steps, nowhere, stubbornly." The stubbornly in French is obstinément. On Marcuse's gravestone is inscribed "Weitermachen," which means keep on going, keep on moving. Marcuse had a unique stance within the Frankfurt School. He drew productively on the whole tradition of Western philosophy to chart a direction for the future. That stance is relevant today in a new period of political activism, much of it posing questions around issues involving technology. Whether it will take on the existential depth he identified with revolutionary possibilities remains to be seen. Philosophical understanding can and must contribute to this movement. It is high time for a fresh look at Marcuse.